Welcome to the Ridgecrest podcast. This is where we take time each week for a deeper look into the previous Sunday's sermon. My name is Matt. I'm the executive and discipleship pastor here at Ridgecrest, and join with me as always is our senior pastor, Michael Estes.
Good to see you today.
Yeah,
I see you're sporting your Tennessee pullover.
That's right. It's not a great time to be a Tennessee fan, but
Don't worry, I'm a fan of a basketball team that is inconsistent and frustrating to watch. Mississippi State's not any better.
yeah,
so.
and we get to see Tuesday night. Yeah,
The movable force versus the stoppable object or something like that. So it's not going to be.
Yeah,
y'all will probably win.
I hope so, because we're on a 2-game losing streak.
Yeah, I fully expect y'all to win.
I'm hoping to break that skid against you all, because we started out really strong, and the past couple of games got snake bit really, and it's how basketball is, though.
Yeah, it is.
So, and then I'm just glad I can still be excited about basketball, because I think the football program is in disarray right now. Of course, they made one good hire, and so
maybe it's finally a step in the right direction for you guys.
I hope so.
It's been weird.
We've been saying that for over 10 years now.
Yeah, that's true. It's funny to me if they even. Well, I don't want to upset my Ole Miss friends on here, but if they even consider hiring Lane Kiffin, rehiring him.
Oh, I know.
Talk about an absolute train wreck. I mean, the Lane train it already blew up once.
Yeah, no,
and man,
I'll give a shout out, to the Tennessee fans back home. They're all over that, and it's crazy, because I'm not a Lane guy,
Yeah.
Sure, he's a great offensive mind,
great coach in a lot of ways.
I think he'll do a very good job at Ole Miss. I don't want to take him away from Ole Miss after being there 1 year, because I've been there. I watched the mattresses get burned in Tennessee when that happened, so I don't really want to relive that in Mississippi, but
I'm available for counseling for our Ole Miss friends if that does happen.
But our the Tennessee fans, they're all over it, and of course they're trying to track the plane and figure out where they're going.
Man.
It's crazy stuff. We talk about Crazy Town a lot. Anytime there's a coaching search in Tennessee,
SEC college football.
Oh yeah, it's nuts, and so it'll be interesting to see what they do, and it's one of those things like fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me.
Absolutely.
So I don't know that I'm definitely not in the Lane support system as far as bringing him back to Tennessee, but the fans have forgotten. They forgot that late night burning of mattresses and extreme anger that he would leave after 1 year and such. But they're okay to do that to Ole Miss and let them experience that.
Oh yeah. Man.
But it's funny, and I don't know how we all of a sudden became sports commentators. We could convert this to a sports talk show, so
you could bring all the hockey knowledge, and
that's right. Which isn't that exciting right now either, because the Predators have dropped 3 in a row now. Started out 2-0, now they've dropped 3 in a row.
Speaking of counseling, Matt, I'm available for you as well, my friend.
I appreciate that. I'm just thankful that I don't have to place my hope in sports.
That's exactly right.
Because I would be one very, very sad human being, given the sports world and my personal fandom right now. But you win some, you lose some. I'm just used to losing more some. So on that note, let's get into the good stuff, the stuff that we do have hope in,
yes.
Which is sanctified suffering.
Isn't that what we've been describing? Something like that.
So great segue into
absolutely. We did not plan that.
I guess the bottom line is we're going to suffer. It's just a matter of what are we going to allow ourselves to suffer over.
Yeah, that's right. What are we suffering for?
Yeah. So kind of along this idea of sanctified suffering, I'm going to here in a moment, I'm going to kind of hone into that piece a little bit more. But to start, kind of the overall, I guess, arching idea that we kind of talked about as a staff, and then even into the sermon, you brought up numerous times, is this idea of living countercultural. And, I can't remember if you brought it up in the sermon or if it was just in staff. I think you may have brought it up both. But you talked about, either a book you had read or, that the individual kind of made the argument that perhaps the reason we are not experiencing persecution as a church is because we're not living countercultural enough.
Well, the person that asked that question, it was in a staff meeting. The person that asked that question was Greg.
Okay.
Greg brought that up, and I thought it was a very astute question. It was right on exactly where, because I think a lot of times what happens is, and I know it's not one of the questions, but what happens a lot of times is because we want a place at the table in a culture, we are willing to use the the structures of the culture and the patterns of the culture in order for us to get that place at the table. And so I'm arguing that we need to think about both the means and the ends of what the culture hands us. So if the culture hands us means that are not biblical and that are really anti-Christian, then we need to reject those means as a way of influencing the culture, and not only live counterculturally as far as the ends that we pursue, but also the means with which we pursue those things. And so we need to think about both ends of that spectrum, I think.
Yeah, and I think that kind of lends itself to really the first question and looking at this idea of how do you strike that balance, because you see this. I think we talked about it maybe last week or the week before on a podcast about this idea of Paul encouraging us to live in culture and being all things to all people, and kind of walks through that with the Corinthians, and and so how do we kind of figure out how to strike that balance in certain issues, but then also being bold enough to live counterculturally in other issues, because you have an extreme of both,
right?
Where I'm going to extreme just live in culture and just embrace it as it is, or I'm going to completely separate and isolate myself from culture. And so the question I have is, if by looking at the church, and again, I don't necessarily mean Ridgecrest, I just mean, just your general perception of the church in the West, we as a whole, body of believers, what would you say are kind of your top 3 areas that you believe the church should be, countercultural and really give attention to that?
Yeah. So the top 3 areas I'll get to in just a second. I want to go back and think about a little bit more about striking that balance, because there's a place in Paul that's an interesting admonition for us. It's in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. He's writing in verse 9 about how we should love one another, and he basically tells the Thessalonians, so I really don't need to write to you about this because you guys do a fantastic job of loving each other.
Right.
And then he goes on in verse 11, and he says that we should aspire to live quietly and to mind our own affairs and to work with our hands as we instructed, so that you may walk properly before outsiders and be dependent on no one. And I know there's a specific context there, but it is interesting that he's like, aspire to live a quiet life. Yeah. But what he's not saying in that is there's never a time in your life where you are going to take a stand for biblical things, or there's not times in your life where you're going to have to live out conviction. But we don't do it for the sake of just disrupting political systems or cultural systems. We do it because it's biblical. We do it because it's truth. And so when we talk about these top 3 areas where we as a church, where the church in general should be countercultural, especially given our historical context right now, and all 3 of mine will be framed in our historical context. I don't want to think about things that the Roman church should have been countercultural about. I want to think about what we as people at Ridgecrest can be countercultural about, and that sort of thing. But as we do this, the goal isn't I'm just going to try to upset apple carts and kind of leave chaos and a mess behind. We're trying to help set life in order. And part of the way we do that is we live out these things before outsiders in a way that shows them that this is a beautiful life. Peter talked about that in chapter 2. He talked about living this life that's a beautiful life. And as we live out that beautiful life, people are they're going to be attracted to what we offer. And so it's not so much we just get on the rooftops and shout about these things. We live these things out. Yeah. And as we live them out, people are interested in, and they want to be a part of it. So, because ultimately I believe that all cultural systems, all political systems, are going to leave people dissatisfied. If they put faith in those things, if they put their hopes in those things, at some point along the way, those things are going to be they're going to fail them, and they'll be dissatisfied. So we want to present them with an option that is an eternal option, that is one that is attractive in all times, all places, to all people. And so top 3 areas. In our historical context, I think these are the top 3. I'm gonna lay them out one by one and kind of talk through why I think these are important. And I think most of them will be pretty obvious as we walk through the list. So the first one is I think we should be countercultural on issues of care for the marginalized. And so people I would include in the marginalized, people who have been pushed to the margins of our society, the unborn. There's no doubt that we are trying to push the concept of personhood further and further back in a person's life to where, it's once a child has a personality and can make decisions on their own or is independent of their parents, that's when they become a person. We as believers argue that personhood begins at conception. It's not when they take their first breath or when they have their first heartbeat. It is at conception that is a person created in the image of God. Then the another group that's on the margin, which is I mentioned both of these in the sermon, the elderly. Our culture is all about the reason that you're valuable as a human being is because you're productive. You add something to society. You contribute in some way, shape, or form to the overall good of society. And people would look at the elderly and say, well, as soon as they stop working or contributing to society, they really don't matter as much anymore. And we always see this happen in lots of different ways. It happens in the sense that I'll tell this part. When I was in North Carolina. Toward the end of my time there, I asked my pastor if there was a ministry that I could help out with, and he pushed me toward an Alzheimer's home, and that specialized in care for dementia and Alzheimer's patients. That mattered to me because I had a grandmother with Alzheimer's, and I got to see firsthand kind of what that did to her, and the experience that my dad in particular had to go through caring for her and that sort of thing. And one of the things that struck me as I would go and visit is and share the Bible with them. They never remembered me most of the time, but they would tell me stories about like their families, that sort of thing. But like these are people that never got visited. Like nobody ever went to see them.
Yeah.
And they were just forgotten about, So that's a group that I would argue has been marginalized by our society, is seen as not as important, not as valuable. I would say those that are disabled or handicapped. That's a group that a lot of times gets marginalized, pushed to the margins. Y'all, one of the things that's most troubling to me is this new surge in eugenics, where we're gonna look at the genetic code of an unborn child, see if it has Down syndrome, and then tell the parents whether or not they should have that child, or we're gonna try to figure out if we can alter the DNA of that child so that we can make it into a quote unquote normal child.
Yeah.
Those are troubling trends for sure. Foreigners in our particular culture, that's a group that people who have either immigrated here legally or illegally. They're a group that have been pushed to the margin very, very, very harshly in some ways. And I would argue that believers are called to, if you look especially in the Old Testament, there's this call to love the outsider and to try to care for them and to provide for them if you can, and give them ways to fit into in our case, Christian culture, and help them find a place to help them feel safe, that sort of thing. And we do, I think we at our church do a fairly good job of this. We have a great ESL program led by Paula Smith and Nancy Bounds, and that international group, that ESL group, those are fantastic groups. I think they do a great job of helping this group, this marginalized group, fit in. And then the poor. And Jesus made it clear that the poor would always be with us. And, what do we as believers do to help the poor? I know that we get really frustrated with things like welfare systems and stuff like that. Part of the reason those exist is because the church, generally speaking, I am not indicting Ridgecrest or any specific church here. Sure. This is, I think, a systemic big problem. But the church, generally speaking, does not do what it should for the poor. you have great ministries like Beautiful Feet that we're a part of that works really hard to help the poor, works really hard to feed and clothe the poor, and so there are exceptions to that rule, and you go to places like that and you're moved by those things. So that's issue number one. I'll be a little bit quicker with the next two. The second issue that I see as kind of important for us to be countercultural about is kind of it's three-pronged thing, but it's all tied together. It's gender, marriage, and sex. Gender is the concept of gender is very much under attack, and we believe that gender is a biblical thing. God has made us male and female. Now, can that gender that idea of gender be skewed by culture in a way that's unbiblical? Absolutely. Like, it can be easy to rip biblical text out of context and do certain things with, just kind of our cultural context to make women into something that they're really not, and make men into something they're really not, and then have people wonder. This is what we call gender dysphoria.
Right.
They wonder, well, okay, I don't seem to fit into either one of these two categories very well. Maybe I'm the other thing. And that's why people are confused about it. And so we as believers have to be really clear as to what the biblical teaching on, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? And to really clearly, I think one of the places that we can do this best is in our families, teach our children that this is what biblical manhood looks like. This is what biblical womanhood looks like, and not try to cram culture's idea in with that. That's harmful to them ultimately, but to let it be a thoroughly biblical understanding of gender. Marriage is the same way. We believe that marriage is between a man and a woman, and that is God's ordained way of us finding satisfaction in others. We also believe in the biblical concept of singleness.
Sure.
I think a lot of times we look at single people and we're like, okay, we're just waiting for them to get married. But God has called some people to singleness, and because the church has taken such a stand on, well, marriage is better than singleness, I think some folks that are single, probably this gets to the idea of confusion again. They're like, okay, something's wrong with me. And so they begin to wonder and question about whether or not, okay, well, maybe I'm not supposed to be single, but I'm not necessarily attracted to the opposite sex, so maybe I need to find satisfaction in the sex that I am.
Yeah.
And so I think that could be a source of confusion on our end. Obviously, the culture is going to push for us to be happy in whatever way. And then biblical understanding of sex is being a gift from God and something that is supposed to be done in marriage. It's for lots of different reasons, for emotional intimacy and physical intimacy and safety. And so like there's lots of things that we go into there. And then the last issue is an issue that we've seen a lot over the course of the last year, and we should be on the forefront of this issue, is the issue of racial justice. We, as the church, should fight for, and this goes back to marginalized, but we should be in favor of all people experiencing opportunities and rights and having the full privileges of what it means to be, a citizen in a particular country, or experience the fullness of human flourishing, those sorts of things, without obstacles that are created by a culture that some of these obstacles are not necessarily intended to be obstacles, but they become obstacles because of years of systemic issues. And so I think the church should be on the forefront of seeing every person made in the image of God and living that out in a biblical and a very beautiful way, and fighting for those who don't have the same opportunities, same abilities that those who would be in the majority culture would experience.
Yeah, and as you said, there are certain aspects of those things that our government tends to do. So it could almost be like, well, it's almost being cultural because our government's already doing some of those things. They're putting laws in place to try to help some of these individuals. Yeah. But the reason laws are put in place is because people are abusing those or not taking care of those things. And so, we living in a free country is, we have laws over everything, and so whenever you start talking about people with disabilities, you have laws that are put in place to protect those individuals, in the workplace, because workplaces view them as, not value, have no value, and so of course the government will try to put in laws in places and things like that. And so I think kind of what you're saying is, the point is we can't wait or expect the government to do these types of things. And while they might do pieces of it, we as the church should be on the forefront.
Yes.
Specifically in some of these areas.
We should be the advocates for these people.
Yeah.
Whoever they might be, and that may mean in some cases, like we have Christian politicians who are fighting specifically for these particular issues.
Sure.
We have people who run businesses who think counterculturally about these issues and take care of specifically these people, and provide them with opportunities that other businesses in the area may not.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. I think those are ways that we can, very practically advocate for those people.
Yeah. Don't strive for the minimum expectation that the government has set. We as Christians can rise to a higher level, and demonstrate that. All right. So continuing, along this idea of sanctified suffering and the idea of persecution, we talked about how, of course, Peter was writing this letter at a time just prior to some pretty intense persecution. And so the question I have is, looking at it from a historical perspective, would you say that the church or persecution against the church has happened kind of abruptly, or would you say that it has happened gradually so that way people can be a little bit more prepared for it, or should we be prepared because it could happen at any time?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's kind of uneven in history. There are times where it's very gradual. Most of the time, it's very gradual. It is something that builds over time, and there are outbreaks of persecution. Like if you think about the Roman Empire in particular, like if we think about the beginning of Christianity, and you have these outbreaks that would take place just occasionally in response to specific issues. Like, so for Nero did not persecute Christians across the empire. He got really upset when Rome burned, and he wanted a scapegoat, so he blamed Christians. And now the folks in Rome experienced really bad persecution.
Yeah.
But it was very temporary. It was only a couple of years, and it did not create an empire-wide policy. Trajan was another emperor who he had some persecution against the church. It was in response to specific localized issues, and he didn't really have a policy on it. But then you get to like 300 AD, a guy named Diocletian, and he wanted to root Christianity out of the empire. He wanted it gone. And that's by that time, Christians had made a huge impact in the Roman Empire. We're talking about 300 AD, so we've had several hundred years at that point of Christians spreading out, sharing the gospel, people believing this, and all of a sudden Diocletian gets to this point where he's like, there's a lot of these guys, and they're starting to make changes, and I don't like the changes that they're making. And so he went in with intense persecution in that situation. And I thought of, Jackson and I have been reading the end of Genesis, beginning of Exodus. That they go down to Egypt. They're in Egypt. They're welcomed there by Pharaoh originally, and all of a sudden they begin to get fruitful and multiply. They're fulfilling that very first thing that God had called people to do, and the new Pharaoh looks and says, "There's a lot of these guys. I don't like this.
Yeah.
If they decided to join another army, they could overcome us." And at that point, so there was this gradual building of persecution of those Jewish folks that were living in Egypt. More and more Israel is persecuted, and finally it gets to a point of just absolutely terrible persecution. They're being forced to work in these ways that they were slaves.
Yeah.
And it was a gradual thing. It happened over time, and then all of a sudden it got to a point to where it was like it was threatening the dominant culture with absolute change at that point. Things that things were never going to be the same. Yeah. Diocletian saw that in AD 300. I think that's typically the way it would work. I can guarantee you, if the number of believers in China, for example, hit a certain number, they're already persecuted pretty heavily. I could see that turning into mass persecutions
Yeah.
of Christians because the Chinese government would feel threatened by this, this belief system that ultimately would be its undoing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So typically, it's gradual.
Yeah.
As really, I think you kind of identified two different ways. Is if it's policy related, it's typically gradual because policy, no matter who you are, it's not something you're just gonna come out tomorrow and completely change policy. It's going to have to be a gradual change, whether it's a democracy or a dictatorship. Even dictators aren't going to implement policy that significant of a change unless something significant happens.
Right. I mean, you can even think about Nazi Germany.
Right.
Hitler didn't all at once start absolutely trying to annihilate the Jewish people.
Sure.
It was a very gradual process. Now, it was a little bit faster than some of the other things that we've
Yep.
talked about, but
Yep.
he didn't just day one say this is the policy we're gonna eliminate and exterminate all the Jewish people.
Right.
He did several things and steps up to that point.
Yeah. And, so you have that, and so while typically it is gradual, there are times in history when a specific event has happened that has caused anger, or a certain whatever has transpired that causes persecution. Maybe not necessarily by the government, but just by local communities or whatever. And so it can be one of those things where for whatever reason a group of believers is attacked for some reason. And so I think it's important. Of course, the whole idea in this sermon and this message and passage was to be prepared
Yeah.
for that persecution when it does arrive. And so sometimes it might be a gradual approach, and we can see it transpiring and know we can be more prepared for when it does happen. Or other times it could be just a sudden event that occurs, and we've got to be ready in either case.
Yes, absolutely.
So along those lines, how would you say, how can we identify, if we are experiencing this kind of sanctified suffering?
I think the easiest way to do it is the way Peter lays out. So I'm going to say what it's not, and then I'm going to say what it is.
Okay.
It is not a result of the generalized suffering due to the fallenness of the world.
Right.
Everyone experiences that. That's where we have issues with disease. Cancer, coronavirus, AIDS. All those sorts of things. Those are a result of the fallenness of the world. A broken leg, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
We all experience that. There are other places in the Bible that you can look to understand
Right.
the Christian response to that kind of suffering. I think Second Corinthians is a fantastic book. If you want to understand how, as a believer, to respond to both sanctified suffering and just generalized suffering, difficulty in life, Second Corinthians, Paul is like a balm for a weary and worn out soul.
Yeah.
Good stuff there. It's also not a result of shameful choices or behavior.
Yeah.
That's exactly what Paul's saying, and Peter's saying in verse 15 of the passage. It was chapter 4, verse 15.
Yeah.
But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. We can a lot of times, because we're looking to justify our actions, we can say, well, I'm suffering this because I'm a Christian and, I'm being tested or whatever. But in reality, it's really because of our shameful, some choices that we've made,
Sure.
behaviors that we've indulged in, that ultimately God can discipline us.
Yeah.
But that should not be the reason that we suffer, and that is not what sanctified suffering is. Not the way that I would classify that. And so, sanctified suffering is a result of being and living as a Christian, being a believer in a world that is either, in our case, post-Christian or pre-Christian. Creates. It can create incredible difficulty, especially if we live counterculturally. And I use the example of a nail sticking out. The old proverb is, if the nail sticks out, it gets hammered down. And that's all about conformity. And Peter's call to us is not to conform. Same thing that Paul says in Romans 12:2. Don't be conformed to the patterns of this world. But instead, we're supposed to live counterculturally. We're supposed to be transformed by the renewal of our mind, so that as we think about these things, we can choose the things that are pleasing to God. Is the direction that Paul goes, for example. So when we make those choices, though, we will stick out.
Yeah.
And in some cases that sticking out is a good thing because we're going to snag people. In other cases, it's going to be a bad thing, or it's going to be a difficult thing. I won't say a bad thing because my point in the sermon and Peter's point is that sanctified suffering is a good thing.
Right.
It's a difficult thing,
Sure.
but it is ultimately good because it glorifies God and it prepares us for what God has for us.
Yeah.
And so that's what I would say is that's how I'd identify it is it's a direct result of living as a Christian counterculturally in the world that God has placed us in.
Yeah. And I think a key part of that, kind of what you're saying, is if we find ourselves in this period of suffering, we should first ask ourselves those questions. So, first of all, is this a result of my own sinful behavior, or is this, a result of, just general sin in the world? And if both of those we can say no to, then it's much more likely that it could be more of the sanctified suffering.
Yeah, and so there's sometimes where we're not even have to run through that checklist. If somebody degrades you because you're a believer, if they tell you you're a fool, they ostracize you because you are a Christian, you can feel pretty confident that what you're experiencing is exactly what Peter's talking about.
Yeah. So in the sermon, you talked about God having kind of an active role, in sanctified suffering, and talking about how he's not creating the suffering, but he's allowing it to happen. And so the question I have is, if we are looking maybe for that opportunity for sanctified suffering, and we're willing to submit to that, is this something that we as individuals kind of go out and look for, say, well, I'm going to find how I can live counterculturally so that, I know by doing this, I'm probably going to experience sanctified suffering? Or is this something that kind of God initiates and brings to us, and then in that moment, we have the opportunity maybe to respond? So I guess who initiates it? Is it us going to look for it, or is it God, initiating it and us kind of responding to?
I think it'll be a both and.
Yeah.
Because God ultimately is going to be the one who allows things to happen in cultures.
Sure.
Now he is actively providentially working all the time, but there are going to be times where situations are going to arise historically, that sort of thing, that God is, he's ruling over history. He knows where things are going. He's omniscient. We can trust that he knows what's going on. And so there are going to be times where we can, because we know that God is omniscient, we can see that God is initiating opportunities for us as believers to respond to the changes that are happening in culture. And then on our end, it's our job to, and the way I put it is to commit ourselves, the way Peter puts it, to entrust our souls to our faithful Creator while doing good. And so the part that we play in it is literally I'm going to entrust myself to my Creator as I live this out. And so as I choose to live counterculturally, as I look at what dominant culture says, this is right, and I believe that it's wrong, or it says this is wrong, and I believe that it's right, I'm going to choose to live in such a way that lines up with what my Creator says is true, and I'm going to trust that He's going to care for me in that. And I think that's really what it looks like. And so, I would say that it's a both and. God initiates, and then and initiate is probably a strong word. He allows.
Sure.
And there are going to be, I don't want to speak for God, where He's not spoken in the Word. But my guess is there are also times where He does actively initiate certain situations to bring about the ends that He desires.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's about His allowance, and sometimes it's about His initiation.
Yeah. Okay. And one of the things you talked about in this pursuit of sanctified suffering, and as we're looking towards this, is this idea of church growth. And you were very clear in the sermon that you weren't talking about necessarily numerical growth or just filling up a bunch of pews with a bunch of people, but it's more of a personal, on an individual level, as far as us as believers, and that kind of depth growth. And so the question is how would you measure success for church growth if it's not necessarily just numbers and looking at the person as a believer? How would you kind of identify success and that?
I think two words come to mind immediately. I only wrote down one on my page, but the word that came to mind as I was listening to you is, so the two words are faithfulness and perseverance. Now, I did say that numerically that wasn't the major concern when it came to church growth. However, one of the things that is very clear in when we look at historical persecution, the church almost always grows numerically when it's persecuted. And I think the reason why is because so often the outside world is looking to see whether or not we really believe this is true. They're looking to see if we're willing to give something up for it. And if they don't see, that level of commitment on our part, then they're just like, well, they're just like us. Like they're just trying to live out the story that makes them feel better about their life. And so, if they don't hold on to the story when it's, the only thing they've got, then why should I care about this? But when that happens and we are faithful and we persevere through it, and people have to question whether or not they have to ask themselves a question: is what they believe really true? And that's when you see people who are kind of on the fence or never even considering Christianity as a viable option for a way to live life. All of a sudden they're like, okay, these people are serious about this.
Yeah.
They're willing to give up their social status or their, as you move through intense persecution, their homes, their families, their livelihood, and maybe even their lives. And that's when you see just explosive growth in the church. It's the reason that the church is growing so quickly in places where persecution is intense. Like China, the church is growing. I mean, exponentially. The largest number of believers in one place, and it's not just because of population numbers. I mean, like we're talking about, there are lots and lots and lots of Christians in China right now, and all they've experienced for most of their Christian lives is persecution.
Yeah.
They've never had a government that's been supportive of their Christian way of living. They never had a society that's been like, yeah, we want to invite this in. I mean, so it's pretty amazing.
Yeah. And I think, as we kind of close out, you have this, along that line of thinking is, you see revival and you see, these points of awakenings and, and kind of all these periods throughout history where persecution was intended to wipe something off the face of the earth, perhaps, and but we still have this Christian faith today, and so in those periods of persecution, you have those committed, faithful believers who are able to persevere through that, and then not only are they able to persevere, but now they're reaching out to those around them, and so as we kind of close out, and everyone who's listening or watching, I want you to kind of be thinking, leave that thought with you to kind of really think on and pray on, as how are you committing yourself to grow in your faithfulness to God and His Word, so that you are able to persevere in whatever challenges may face, so that way we can see that growth, and we do have that desire to reach out into our community, reach out into our world, and lead people to Him. Is the only individual who can provide hope in this world. And so, as always, if you have any questions or would like to talk further or dive into anything else that we discussed or maybe didn't touch on today, as always, you're encouraged to reach out to either one of us through phone, email, any of our other staff members. Be happy to have those conversations with you. But as always, we hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time.